Okay, time to put the game face on.
Yeah, sorry to drop that on
No,
you.
it's fine. I usually have the little bit of time in the green room to get into razzle dazzle mode, but
Yeah.
but
I think we were on page now 172.
yeah, I think we're starting the section on System 2.
System 2. Yeah.
So, welcome to the Brain of the Firm reading group, 17th maybe session. Who the fuck knows at this point?
I think we're 16 now, maybe.
Okay. Yeah, we're still on Chapter 12. Chapter 12 is Autonomics, Systems 1, 2, and 3. We've got through System 1, which was the first couple of pages, and that took a while. But now we're on to the part about System 2. We're picking up here at the bottom of page 172. Notes on the operation of System 2. So I'm going to read a little bit. System 2 is the metasystem subsuming all Systems 1. Throughout this book, its existence has been diagrammatically indicated by the tall, thin, rectangular box drawn around the column of boxes, which are themselves the System 1. However, the mechanisms of System 2 are found in the interlinking of the divisional regulatory centers and in the corporate regulatory center, as shown in Figure 31. So it would be correct and even helpful to think of System 2 as an elaborate interface between Systems 1 and 3. It partakes in both. Pretty sweet to get some clarity on exactly what System 2 is. I took this to mean that that System 2 is really the sort of network and interfaces between the Systems 1. It's the nerve channels, plus this little bit at the top, right, that we've been looking at, the sort of medium-sized triangle at the top of the other triangles, which seems to act as this kind of like helper with this intercommunication. Let's go on a little bit. The need for a System 2 was explained at some length as being the only means whereby uncontrolled oscillation between the divisions could be prevented. Consider now exactly how this works. An example from any kind of operation will do, since all operations are measured and monitored in terms of achievement indices. Suppose that Division B receives a raw material from Division A, which is for A a finished product. Note the physical stuff will be transferred from A to B down the squiggly pipeline, which joins their two circles in Figure 27. The requisition of the raw material, however, and its acknowledgement, progressing, and invoicing are all information transfers, which will occur on the vertical paravertebral chains shown in Figure 31. So, any comments on this little bit here about System 2? Because I feel like that's the main chunk of the theoretical stuff, and a bit of the rest of this is going to be walking through a kind of example, but the main bit is actually in there. Who we got? Jake H.
Yeah, I think I thought it interesting. It talks about the need for System 2 being the only means whereby uncontrolled oscillation between divisions. So, I mean, is that, is prevented? I mean, is that basically saying, kind of without this, there's the potential for oscillations to, still occur, or even oscillations will occur even with the System 2, but then just not be controlled unless there is that System 2? Because that's kind of how I'm seeing it. I mean, those systems can kind of communicate with each other. And if you scroll back up or turn back page to Figure 27, there's it's in between each System 1, there's this little squiggly line that they describe. So I guess it's basically, is System 2 not supposed to be the totality of the connections between System 1, System 1s, so that there's still kind of connections that aren't necessarily captured by System 2 explicitly?
So there's a couple of layers to that. I think the first one that jumps out at me is, I think, uncontrolled oscillation, I think, is a sort of redundant term. I think it's a term of art that, oscillation is taken to be uncontrolled, and uncontrolledness is taken to be oscillations. I think it's a slightly redundant term, but you're right, it sort of does imply there would be a controlled oscillation or a uncontrolled something other than oscillations. Kyle, go for it.
I'm not totally certain that that's the case because you could have, like, say, a regular material transfer between two system ones, and that would be an oscillation, but it would be a regular one,
Sure,
right? Like,
right.
it would just be like, oh, like A, B, A, B, A, B, A, B. So the rate would be controlled and the rhythm would be controlled. It's yeah, I think the uncontrolled oscillation is when we have the it gets progressively worse, right?
Yeah.
Like the fluctuations become more and more extreme.
Indeed. Mark O, go for it.
Yeah, so just going back to the last section of the book and the system 2 talk there, I think of, like, his example is like, oh, hey, Department A is usually ships 800 units to Department B for processing, but then there's hey, we're running a little bit late, so try and do something else. And the uncontrolled oscillation is like, oh, okay, so I sent some people home. Oh, then it all came in. Now we need people back, and it just takes longer for people to, like, get caught up with their normal work and, like, have the say know what's coming and, like, have everybody staffed when they need them and be on top of that. So
Yep, definitely. I think Jake also mentioned something about the squiggly lines. So that this is mentioned just at the end of the part that we just read. So if we look back at figure 27 on page 157, the divisional circles are connected by these squiggly lines, and that, I think, those are the sort of, like, imminent material flows, like the real material connections between things. And then over to the right, they're also sort of interconnected through system 2. And what he's saying here is that the actual furnishing of the real material flow, the energetic flow, will be in the squiggly lines, and it happens just in the activity of the thing itself. But it's the regulation of that flow that happens in system 2. So it's the bookkeeping and the kind of order processing and stuff like that. So it's like you get a pile of bricks, but you also get an invoice for a pile of bricks. And the invoice is the system 2 sort of thing, and the bricks are the bricks. Yeah, Kyle, go for it.
On the Wikipedia diagram, those squiggly lines are labeled as operational linkages in the legend at the bottom. I don't know if that helps at all, but I just saw that in the bottom of the page there.
I think that does. That's good terminology. I'm just getting that diagram up again. But Beer does kind of emphasize a couple of times throughout the book that what we're contending with in the viable system model is a control system that is not identical to the system that the, like, imminent real system. Like the flow of blood is a thing, but the regulation of the rate of flow of blood is a control system. So there's this kind of, like, sticky, messy, kind of real interconnectedness, and then there's this, like, interconnectedness of a control system, which are not necessarily the same thing, but you probably want them to map fairly closely to each other. I've just put a link to the good Wikipedia diagram in the chat also. Rudy, go for it.
Yeah, I was thinking, like, how sometimes it looks like system 2 is the collection of all system 1s, and how sometimes system 2 is drawn as something outside the system 1s, and I'm having a bit of trouble making sense of this.
When I got to speak to some of the people at Metaforum, I was quizzing them about the same sort of thing, and I came away with the impression that System 2 is the sort of communications network and the coordination technologies that allow for coordination. So, for example, like Slack or email or Discord or whatever would be one of the System 2 kind of substrates. It's one of the things that allows for synchronization. But one example that Stafford actually uses, I'm not sure he uses it in the book, but he uses it elsewhere, is using a calendar as System 2. So in a school, you have all of these different processes going on, and they're all contending for limited resources such as rooms and laboratories and so on. And that is potential for conflict. There's going to be conflict over these things. Like, I want to use it, you want to use it, that sort of thing. And the way to resolve the conflicts and the way to prevent oscillation and instability is to use something that synchronizes the activity. And that something could be as simple as a calendar or an email, just saying, okay, you use it on Tuesday, I'll use it on Wednesday. And that's the synchronization. So some of the System 2 stuff seems to kind of melt into the background, especially if you don't actually have those conflicts. Because, imagine like in an organization where everyone just starts to naturally use calendars for this kind of purpose. That stuff would kind of melt into the background, much in the way that the nervous system melts into the background for the organism. It's kind of unremarkable until it's missing. It's when the nerve endings are severed, then you notice their absence, because things suddenly become desynchronized. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah. Cool. And I think similarly for like Slack or something like that, it's just like, or even I think in software development, like Git would be a System 2 component, where it's a protocol that prevents or resolves conflicts with simultaneous independent action. So you have many developers operating autonomously on what is conceptually the same unit of work, and their changes and all their stuff gets synchronized and integrated through this piece of infrastructure. But that's one that doesn't jump out as being especially obvious either. Jake H.
Yeah, I like that description as kind of like something that's a little less like made up of a group of people who do this sort of thing, and more like a sort of automatic process that like collects these things, and then System 3 is the thing, and 3A is the thing that reports to 3, but 3 is the thing that actually deals with when there's a problem. But like taking Git for an example, like, it just works until it doesn't, and then suddenly there's a problem, like I can't, pull from master or whatever, whatever it is, something, that's when sort of the higher process needs to come to play. And then it's like, okay, this is working fine, and now there's a problem.
Or when you have to get into rebasing, and it's like, oh shit, this thing's broken down now and it's noticeable, whereas everything else was unremarkable until that point.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I think that sort of, if I'm understanding this correct, it kind of has crystallized a little bit more for me. Definitely seems like a place where, when considering like an organization, that's something that like is just a matter of finding the right processes, and not so much like a matter of making sure people are doing the work of like collecting these things. I mean, there could be that too, but just like having the right spaces and like tech, like place, whatever structures in place to like collect the things and like bring things together. Yeah.
You'd hope for it to be automatic, because you kind of don't want to be turning that crank by hand, because it's a lot of work, right? You kind of want the calendar to just work automatically, so that you don't need to intervene to do that sort of stuff. I guess that's where you get the kind of layering from System 2 to 3, is that like System 3 is a more active kind of interventional sort of thing, whereas you'd really hope that the System 2 infrastructure just kind of works. And if it isn't working, it would probably require intervention. Fellow Jitster, whoever that is, the one person who's not named.
I didn't realize that it didn't put me on a name. I'm on my phone. What's it? I think with System 1, System 2, I think like a lot of the infrastructure that we deal with kind of does double duty, because like if System 1 is like like it's not it's not the actual arm, so System 1 is the neuromuscular junction, if I'm getting this right, like between like where it's where the rubber meets the road. It's where the nervous system actually is like dealing with like effectors and sensors. And so like something like Jira like is kind of both System 1 and System 2 for you, because like when it's just giving you your task, it's it's System 1. But like when it's like looking for who's blocking who and stuff, like then it's System 2.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Definitely. Kyle.
Oh yeah, this talk of like coordination mechanisms just had me thinking about that recent revelation that Twitter was being used as a counterinsurgency data gathering platform, and the way in which coordinating protest on Twitter has become quite fraught because of that. So if your system 2 is co-opted by your enemy, it's a big problem because it's kind of like there's a lot of regular coordination information that's being shared there.
Absolutely, right? Yeah. Jake?
Yeah, that actually makes me think of System 2 obviously is very necessary, but just the sort of problems with you're saying trying to organize protests on Twitter, or just trying to organize protests or meetings on Facebook, of just having kind of a really high level of having a System 2 where there's a really high level of variety can cause problems where it doesn't properly integrate people, because there's kind of all these other pathways for them to shoot off into. It's just been something I've been thinking a lot about in terms of my organizing, of just having a more dedicated space for connecting with the people doing the organizing that's not also used as a distracting social media, because it's just you'll kind of get people who wander into it, who get connected to it without necessarily being plugged into the work, because they're already on Facebook, and so they follow the page and they see that it's happening. But it can also lead to like you said with Twitter, it can lead to bad actors kind of being aware of what you're doing, and it can lead to I guess improper connection to System 3, where there's not a great way to really see sort of the overview of how the connections are working. I don't know.
Yeah.
That's an interesting way of thinking about it.
Yeah, definitely. That's certainly a interesting sort of thought, and especially when these are they're recreational platforms as well. It's it's just it's very easy to get distracted by the cool shiny or whatever happens to be going on. Let's read a tiny bit more. So this is just after the part where we're talking about the requisition and the information transfer amongst the System 1s. How, first of all, is this requisition placed? In most firms, an actual internal order for the raw material is originated by B and sent to A. Yet in most instances, although one can think of exceptions, this is a silly procedure, a ritual which people think must be undertaken for the sake of sound accounting in the office. It is contrary to the notion of continuous planning and control developed throughout this book. In fact, Division A knows very well that a volume of this particular raw material flows to Division B, and it currently produces what B currently consumes, unless that it is an interdivisional stock of the stuff is held. In that case, more complicated rules may be used to govern A's output and to suit B's input. But in general and over a period, actuality is the same for A as for B in relation to this material. If it were not so, the stock, or Q, as we call a stock we do not like, would become infinitely large, or else B would have idle capacity or for lack of supplies. So that's an interesting piece, right? That it's not so much that the order placing, the invoicing is kind of a sideshow. There's a continuous flow that is, realistically, it is predicted on both ends. And in fact, that flow has to continue for any of this stuff to work. So doing the bookkeeping is kind of it's just bookkeeping, really. It's not, when you place the order, the same fucking order every month. It's like you go down to the grocery store for the same pack of smokes you've been getting every day for the past 20 years. And it's like, well, you could have predicted that was going to happen. There's not much information content in going and doing it. Kyle.
Yeah, this kind of reminded me, if I remember correctly, there is a section in Capital Volume 3 that is about clearinghouses, and it really reminded me of what Beer's saying here. Mark's sort of explaining why they're useful in that section reminded me a lot of what Beer is saying here. Sometimes you just need the operation to clear, and you don't need to go through a whole complicated process of transaction to do it.
In fact, you're better off not doing that, because there's a if you were doing all of the nitty gritty transaction stuff all the time, there's a cost to all of those little actions. You're better off abstracting over it.
Yeah.
You get this efficiency of, well, it's the same stuff shows up every month. Just keep it rolling, and you can kind of forget about the details. It's this process of abstraction over the details.
It sort of again gets it. It gets at that how like terrible the idea was with Sears of creating like internal markets, right?
Absolutely.
It's like you're just adding all this extra noise to what's going on.
Cool, Jeremy.
I think the reason why you have these A to B requisitional things that Beard doesn't like is because at the top they don't really trust anyone below. And so it could really easily be like, oh, hey, you have some things? Yeah, you send them to us every month? Fine, everything is fine. But you know that people at the top are terrified that subordinates are stealing. And therefore they have to mark everything down, even if it screws up their entire business, because the CEO is lying awake at night worried that people are stealing from him, And so, I think I think this is sort of hitting the pathology of capitalism.
Yeah. It's interesting that also, I think, ties in with like this history of, I mean, it has a labor angle as well. So with the history of shipping, like prior to containerization, like I guess like old school shipping, you kind of expected to lose maybe 10% of the stuff along the way because, the boys, they have their little cut off the top every time they unload and stuff like that, right? The shipping and handling folks, the folks that work on the ships. And when you were sending grain or like boxes of screws or whatever overseas, you just kind of expected some of them to disappear because that was just understood to be the way things worked. And it was, the way that the shipping folks kind of padded out some of their income. That all went away with containerization because now you've got these big locked boxes and you've got this very tightly controlled process where every little tiny thing is accounted for. And you suddenly can't really have an entire shipping container go missing halfway along the way. Whereas, you could take a little scoop of grain out of that box and who's going to fucking notice? It's that's what you get for your bread the next day. So yeah, there is certainly a paranoiac kind of instinct in these capitalist firms to account for absolutely everything, so as to leave no elbow room whatsoever for labor to do anything, and especially not stealing from them, which was cool and good, and should be continued. Rightio, let's read this big chunk of page 174, which does actually, I think, get into some of this. These kind of more crazy dynamics. Then we start with the notion of a material flow, which, however governed to suit the two divisions, is understood to exist and to be adjusted to B's actuality, which varies with its own order book. Here we have a simple error-controlled feedback system. Now suppose that for complex reasons A's capability falls. Its productivity will then be affected. Suppose it is so affected that the measure of achievement for the production of this material leaves its statistical achievement group. In Division A, this will be detected at Step 3, and a replanning process will take necessary action through Steps 4, 5, 6, and 7 to make sense of the production program. The directorate will be alerted so that its members, the B and C functions of Figure 30, do what they must do to investigate matters, hopefully to restore productivity to its former level. So, things change, situation changes, half of the crew in part A falls sick and capability drops. So internally, this has to be replanned. The next question concerns the impact of all of this on Division B, whose supplies are now in jeopardy. In an orthodox system, it is a moot point whether or when B will be officially informed. The supplying management may be too proud, too optimistic, or too forgetful to alert the consuming management. If not, what is actually to be said? We are having a bit of trouble in the annealing, old man. We'll alert Division B, whose managers will then try to discover what this remark means. Will the material be late? And if so, how late? How much stock is there? Should they go outside for supplies, and so on? So this is a really good example of this cascade from internal problems in Division A that will impact B, but in this, orthodox way of doing things, the people in A are incentivized to save their own skins, so they sort of nudge, wink, let on, there's maybe problems, but they won't tell you exactly what the problems are. Now it's time for Division B to freak out, and, we're going to get into oscillation. Any remarks on this so far? Mark? Oh.
that section kind of cracks me up because it's like, wait, is that like, I think you just explained it well, but like the way it's written, it's like, is that just British understatement? Like, oh, spot of bother, Yeah. Be specific, man.
Exactly.
Anyways, just
there is a bit of that. I think it's a rather sort of British thing, but there's certainly this. I guess we saw it all over the place in the Soviet Union, right, where nobody would tell you the right numbers because they were fucking terrified of just being shot.
Totally, and that happens in the U.S. too. But yeah,
yeah, definitely. Right?
It's like with the COVID misreporting.
Totally.
Definitely right. Steve.
Yeah, it reminded me of, as Kyle already brought up, the People's Republic of Walmart Sears example, right? I mean, that seems like a perfect example where like everybody was sort of guarding themselves and off siloed on their own, and it's not actually a way to keep things streamlined and moving forward. It's just everybody working against each other.
Right, yeah. It ends up with a kind of circular firing squad dynamic in the whole company or in the whole organization, right? Like everyone's out to get everyone else because they're all desperately trying to defend themselves. Not good stuff. Jake, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, like, it's kind of already brought up the sort of example, like, or rather just like what happens in American corporations, and then like, what happened what would have happened in like the USSR if, you weren't able to get the needed materials from Division A. You just end up like lying, or you end up trying to make do or whatever. And it's just kind of just makes me think of this sort of the hand waving away of like how to deal with the stuff that like a lot of people who haven't sort of given it the sort of cybernetic thought do, of just like, well, if there's a problem, then the workers will deal with it, and it's like, what does that mean in real life? It means that they don't deal with it, or like, and then you get that sort of unwanted, uncontrolled oscillations, because then their output is not able to be used by the divisions that need it. And so I'm just like, once again, sort of reminded of this sort of the new way of thinking, or I guess the sort of uniqueness of like Peter's thoughts of just like, here's an actual way of dealing with it, or here's the sort of necessary systems that we need to actually deal with it, not in a way that just sort of hand waves it off as if, this kind of thing will just spring up automatically, or that it's unnecessary to think about, but just like, I don't know, just this is very interesting stuff. I'm glad it's something I wouldn't have thought of before reading here.
I think one of the other things that happens usually is that this stuff gets naturalized. It's just, this is human nature, or this is, these departments. It's like, well, what would you expect from those guys? It's of course they're going to be late with the stuff. I've seen this in software engineering, where it's like the sort of flow of bugs from production, from development to the support team is all over the fucking place. And every new deployment brings its own flood of bugs. And the support people, or the customer support people, just kind of come to expect. It's like, well, the developers are jackasses. Of course they're going to produce bugs, right? And it's often that feedback loop between the two departments isn't sufficiently closed. And they don't have meaningful feedback to like, it's like if you have a backflow of problems because you're producing problems, then you're incentivized to like actually create structures like, we should have automated testing so that we don't discover bugs in production. And that's how you regulate the defect rate down to zero. And that's how you make the two departments happy. But in the absence of all of that, in the absence of even the concept of feedback, it's just like, well, this is the nature of the things. It is the nature of developers to produce terrible software, and it's in the nature of support people to drive themselves insane trying to support this stuff. And that's just naturalized, right? Indeed. Let's crack on a small bit. So now complicate this example one little bit. Suppose that not only division B, but divisions E, F, and G also use A's product. Perhaps B could borrow from the E, F, or G stocks, but these divisions are threatened too. Suddenly we are in a competitive situation instead of a collaborative one. And the experience shows that this is where communications break down. For an element of gamesmanship is introduced into an already complicated situation. The fact that all of this can happen, has happened, often happens, leads to a new result. The consuming divisions adopt a cautious policy about their stocks and try to build them up. The financial authorities become alarmed, the performance of investment is being adversely affected, and they intervene. Meanwhile, all concerned devise rules and procedures for handling the situation which are supposed to be fair, supposed to be collaborative, supposed to be optimal. But by now, people are playing poker with the situation. Trust is lost. Informal rules are adopted at the divisional level, which are intended to secure local satisfaction, and oscillation has set in. Yeah, this is interesting where this like the emergence of all of these complex rule sets to deal with the catastrophe, that all comes after the catastrophe, and it takes the catastrophe to be its ground truth. The ground truth, like you see this in bourgeois thought, right? You see it in the Hobbesian view of the world and all this kind of stuff, right? That like mistrust and conflict are the fundamental ground truths. And all of this Leviathan shit needs to be there to deal with that problem. But there's a fundamental problem beneath it all, that is the oscillation and blockage and obstruction of these like material flows, these like immanent flows of life, of production. They're all fucked. They're all blocked, and they're all diverted in crazy ways because they're not actually controlled and regulated properly. And it's all of the wild bourgeois stuff emerges as a sort of paranoid, fearful response to the conditions that are produced by the instability. But the irony is that those things are not an answer to the instability. They're not actually going to solve it. At the absolute best, they're going to be a band-aid solution. They'll be a palliative. But the fundamental contradiction of a society that is divided within and against itself, that will still be there. The organism will still be at war with itself, but maybe we can patch up some of the damage. Kyle, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, this is essentially what socialism came to mean under the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. That kind of interdivisional competition was rampant. Hoarding was rampant for exactly the reason that Beer describes. And for people's everyday life, there was a constant need to accumulate bureaucratic credentials that would allow them to just perform the most basic things, like getting their, water in their apartment working again. Mm-hmm. So you need to have like a form from this department certifying this and that and the other thing. And that originally came from essentially the mistrust that the Bolsheviks had towards the Soviet population, because they were trying to build a worker state in a peasant country, which is, bad. And then beyond that, there was the sort of oscillations and chaos of war communism, right? And this all just sort of led a legacy, or led a foundation that, or create a foundation that led to this legacy of informal resource allocation and very sclerotic internal bureaucratic procedure. So really the section that Beer's describing about one firm, it kind of just describes the entire history of the USSR as well.
Definitely, right. And I think this is, I mean, it's not like it's only popping up here in Beer. This is stuff that comes up elsewhere, right? But like, it's at this level of analysis that I kind of insisted that the USSR has to be written off as a catastrophic and abject failure. Like it did not actually improve the fundamental relations of society or production in this kind of way, it actually led to this paranoia spiral and just like ever increasing insanity. Whereas the objective of socialism should be to do what Beer is suggesting here and actually solve the problem at its root, so that the productive flows of life are synchronized correctly and can do without all of that fucking weird infrastructure and that like patchwork of informal ad hoc rules that is built up to govern scarcity and to govern madness, right? You want to cut below the madness and solve it at that level. Jake, go for it.
Yeah, I was thinking something very similar, just like sort of the fact that, this example that Beer's giving is obviously under capitalism. And so sort of the general relations of society are such that, when all else fails, people resort to what they know, what they're, brought up within. And that is the sort of capitalist bourgeois mindset of competition, of, everyone out for themselves. And I think it also, like, relating it to, like, the USSR and other, like, socialist projects, I think it's, like, an example of, like, or maybe not an example, but just further proof that they didn't, like, fundamentally, like you said, fundamentally alter the relations of production. Because when you get down to it, when the what was nominally the system in place falls apart or fails, people just revert right back to sort of this capitalist mode, even if they don't necessarily. You could say that the peasants were resorting more back to sort of peasant mode of just like sealing themselves off, if you were, just like dealing with their own locals. But so I think it was really like important and like a good indication of like socialism should not allow for people to slip back into that mode. Like if it does, then it's a failure in an attempt of socialism. You can say all these things that it did better than what came before, but you can say that about capitalism. And it's like what we're really looking for is something that doesn't devolve into this mode, or just doesn't devolve back into sort of capitalist production or relations of production. Whenever something falls apart, because unfortunately, like we're gonna have to build it into the system. And I think that's where beer comes in really important.
Absolutely, right. I mean, it's right here, right, that like you get into a competitive situation instead of a collaborative one. I mean, like we get these phrases, right, like the cooperative commonwealth, or like a collaborative society, a socially organized society. And I mean, if you collapse from an attempt at a cooperative commonwealth into a competitive commonwealth, it's game over. It's gone, right? I don't think. Like, I mean, my assessment of it is that what we see in the USSR didn't even remotely resemble a cooperative commonwealth. It was very much institutionally not that. But let's crack on. The intention behind System 2 is twofold. First, the change in productivity in Division A is automatically relayed to the other divisions by Step 3A. The change notified is neither fuzzy nor emotive. It is a statistical statement couched in achievement numbers. The regulatory centers in other divisions can immediately evaluate the effect on their production plans and programs and look to the performance measures of their own stocks. Secondly, the corporate regulatory center, receiving all this information, is enabled to take a higher order view of the total consequences. It will report to System 3, which, be it remembered, is on the vertical command axis, and can take managerial action invoking, if necessary, the authority of System 5. The corporate regulatory center, it can be seen, is acting vis-a-vis System 3, very much as the input synapse on the horizontal command axis acts vis-a-vis System 1. So 2 layers to it. System 2 is relaying the data coming out of System 1 and passing it back and forth to all the other ones. So it's like keeping everyone up to date on everything. This is a lot like your stand-ups, your daily stand-ups in software development, right? Like everyone's catching up on everyone else with just these very little snippets of what's going on. And then there's a slightly higher level sort of integration where there's the System 2 is also keeping an eye on things in general and is able to act as this input synapse to transduce information upwards into System 3, and it would be able to alert it to crazy stuff going on if it felt the need to do so. But it also has this like layered reporting thing. So like the systems 1 are reporting to each other in this fairly continuous sort of way, and then system 2 is aggregating some of that stuff and pushing it upwards into system 3, and keeping an eye out for things going badly wrong. Any remarks on this part so far? Matt, go for it.
Yeah, going through this part again with the Git metaphor in mind, like I feel like it maps on like pretty cleanly. Like it would be system 2, saying, hey, there's a merge conflict, and then like that activates like higher levels to actually it gets the attention of people, or it doesn't. Like system 2 operating would also say, oh, okay, like no, this can be merged without anything, or it can tap system 3 or eventually even system 5, actual like maintainers of the repo, to make decisions and like tell you like what exactly you need to do in order to have it not conflict.
Yeah, and I guess there's layers to that as well, right? That like there's merge conflict just because of some white space changes or whatever, or some minor formatting changes, and it's like, fine, fuck it, and we'll fix those. There might be a merge conflict because, but at a higher level, there could well be a conflict because there's like something fundamentally incompatible about the design of the thing, and it's actually completely incompatible with some other module, and that would need intervention from higher. You'd have to actually get some heads together, probably some lead engineers and so on, to really sort out like that sort of thing. But you'd hope that it's all handled lower down. There's no reason for a white space change, and would need to alert the most senior engineers on the team. It's like, who gives a shit? Just fucking fix the white space, Indeed. Anything else, or shall we crack on? Nope. Cool. Perhaps the main point of this whole arrangement is its automatic simplicity, and therefore its speed. The message that something has changed, and like this, goes simultaneously from the divisional regulatory center to 1, the divisional directorate, 2, other regulatory centers, and 3, the corporate regulatory center, whence onward to system 3 if required. The job of the divisional directorate is first and foremost to discover what went wrong, what made this happen, and to devise measures to put it right. Meantime, everyone else has other fish to fry. The change is, for this epoch at least, a fact, and one which must be coped with. So the divisional regulatory center has reprogramming to do. The other divisions have consequences to draw and reports to make quickly to the corporate regulatory center. That center itself has to take fast corrective action, either through its regulating machinery or, if managerial prerogatives are involved, via system 3 and the command axis. So yeah, it's this flow of consequences, right? Some shit went wrong in division A, fine, whatever, we have to deal with it. A needs to start replanning. B, C, D, E, and F need to check their plans. And if it turns out that D and F have a problem, they need to rope in system 2, probably the higher parts of system 2 to help them out. Or if things are going very badly wrong, and say the corporate regulatory center notices that there's a circular problem between A to D to F to G to A, and there's like a fuck up loop that's starting to take shape. It needs to fire an alert signal and put a flare into the air and say, fuck, quick, system 3, get in here, we need to sort this out now. Any remarks? It's all pretty clean stuff compared to the system 1 part in the early part of the chapter. It's all fairly straightforward, I think. No, cool. Let's get this last couple of paragraphs for this section then. Contrast this with the orthodox procedures with which we are acquainted. The matter is not referred to the corporate level, if it ever is referred, until the oscillation has set in. This generates a difficult problem in terms of control theory, quite apart from human attitudes. But by the time these two have degenerated into suspicion and defensiveness, there is an appalling management problem of a social and psychological sort as well. Small wonder that these fundamental oscillatory mechanisms in the firm and in government and society at large prove so very damaging. They are a curse of our age, because our age has produced so many large-scale organizations without a system too. Most of the successful ones I have observed have been entirely unofficial and largely unrecognized. The corporate regulatory center, then, is both a monitor and coordinator of divisional centers, and also an input filter on the path to System 3, to which we now turn. which we probably won't turn in this session. But that last point is interesting, right? That like the system 2 is either missing or it's present but completely unofficial. It's water cooler conversation and stuff like that. It's rumors that are circulating, or it's something along the lines of the skunk works, where the workers recognize the need for synchronization, and so they do it informally using carrier pigeons or something, because email is blocked in the network. We can't talk to each other, or they walk to each other's offices and update each other that way. Okay, so any thoughts on all this? I feel like this section on System 2 was actually pretty straightforward, but we do have a bit of time if we want to talk about it. And I think next time we can get on to the part about System 3, because it is fairly chunky. Kyle, go for it.
Yeah, I think I'm mostly interested in seeing the distinctions between the regulatory centers and the System 3 activities. Because we talked a little bit about that in the System 1 discussion, as to like how the regulatory centers don't really like formulate their own strategies. They kind of draw on a playbook to make decisions and to analyze situations. But I'm interested to see in the section on System 3 what the specific differences are with the way that System 3 addresses those problems, and how they refer to each other. Yeah.
I feel like the System 2 thing is fairly value neutral in terms of plans and particularities. I think the System 2 stuff it looks like it's supposed to be general communications and coordination infrastructure that isn't too concerned with what your plan is. It just wants to know if it's changed and to help relay things along. So it has this kind of like, it's an assistant, right? Like it's a service that's provided to the System 1 units. And the service is to help them synchronize themselves. Whatever plan they happen to be enacting, System 2 is there to help them do the plan, or to help them adjust each other's plans according to the changes that are happening, rather than System 2 having its own plans as such. And then there's the monitoring thing, which I guess the monitoring part, like if we look at the Wikipedia diagram, we're probably talking about the System 2 triangle in the upper right, the one next to System 3. That probably does need some kind of sense of what's supposed to be going on, so that it knows what to look for. Maybe not, though. I mean, if we're talking about these achievement indices, it might just be enough to say, oh shit, the number's going down, like the line go down, we better get moving, Maybe it doesn't actually need to know all that much about what the plans are.
Yeah, from what I remember, there was kind of a bit of a back and forth between System 3 and System 2 about that, from what we discussed in the System 1 section. They would kind of talk to each other about what things ought to look like.
Sure. Yeah, I guess, I'm kind of remembering that sort of stuff now. And I guess, that's half of the point of the achievement indices, is that it sort of reduces this very rich performance thing down to these sets of numbers. And it's like, well, there's a problem when the numbers goes down, right? You may not need to know precisely what the number represents. You just need to know that it represents a problem. Okay, but yeah, I think we'll get onto that in Section 3 then. Matt, how's it going?
Hey, I feel like with System 1 or System 2 to System 3, it's like System 2 is kind of like where maybe kind of like a original like control theory kind of stops. Like System 2 kind of seems like System 2 is cruise control. Like there's no like it's kind of just very sort of simply just or like the old like World War I machine guns on planes, where like there was like a little mechanism that synchronized it so that it only fires when the propeller is not going to be like in front of the bullet.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, and like System 3 is kind of where we get into like biology or I guess more modern systems where like there's like a sense of but like a modern plane has a sense of like crisis mode, or or a modern car probably does even too. But most machines that have some way of regulating themselves like don't even necessarily like have that layer, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we've gone from like these atomic components, the system ones, right, and they're spitting out numbers, and then we have this layer, this mesh of partial integration, so that any given two system ones should be able to kind of help themselves a little bit in balancing themselves. But then it's at system 3 that we get to the first real layer of full integration, like full bodily integration, where it is a sort of continent whole, and it is supposed to be able to fully contain itself. But we're building those layers up, and we're going to get there. But yeah, you're right. Like, I mean, you have that thing of like the gun only fires when the propeller isn't in front of it, which is synchronization between two components. But then in a modern aircraft, the whatever fucking flight computer is doing a full integration of the full body of the plane and is noticing like, wait, shit, like two of the propellers are out and the landing gear's fucked. This is red flashing lights mode. But it's because it has that full vision of, or it has a filtered version of the full vision of what's going on in the plane. Okay, Steve.
Yeah, I mean, I also try to internalize this too in terms of like, where does the control theory stop and where do you have to get into like higher levels of planning? And like the way that I interpreted this too is that, and I agree with Matt on this, like system 2 is sort of where the end of the control theory stops. But I think about it in terms of like, the controllers can go and they can track their reference signals, and, maybe that reference signal is not a single point. Maybe it's like, track the moving plane or track the sinusoid, that sort of thing. But like at some point, that's not going to be sufficient, or somebody needs to decide, which sinusoid you're actually tracking at any given time. And like that's where the system 3 sort of has to come in and say, this is really what you should be paying attention to. And then once you do, go regulate it as you need to. Mm-hmm. And it also like, really emphasizes, or I guess underscores like where the sort of reactive regulatory feedback stops and where actual complex planning comes in. Mm-hmm. And planning could be like a very complicated motion, but like who does that? Who figures that out? Right. And that seems like it can only really start happening when you get to the system 3 level, because you're incorporating the other constraints, other environmental models, all sorts of things like that allow you to be more sophisticated about what the underlying systems can then go regulate. So mm-hmm. that's, I'm constantly mapping this onto that level of stuff, and it makes sense, right? There are these boundaries and layers of complexity that we have to keep putting on top of each other to really get the full solution. Yeah, totally. You can't get it all done in a winner, unfortunately. What if there was just one function? You just plug all the numbers into it and it just spit out the right result. Okay. Anything else? Any other remarks? Because if not, we're hitting around the hour mark, so we can wrap up. Or if we want to discuss a bit more, that's fine too.
I'm good wrapping. I know we went pretty short on this session, but
can't wait them all, huh?
I think it'll be good to like dedicate a whole session to discussing System 3, as opposed to sort of blowing through into that and then having the discussion cut in half. And then we'll finally be done this chapter. Amazing.
Yeah. Maybe. So next time we'll have 1, 2, 3, 4, 4.5 pages to cover. And today we got through 3, I guess. 4. Yeah. Actually, no. Yeah. So that we can definitely have a pretty substantial session next time for System 3. I'm also fine with wrapping. Thanks everyone. It's been wonderful as always. And we will catch you all again next week.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks a lot.
See you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.